Well, good morning, friends. Good afternoon, good night, good evening. I don't know where you are in the world listening to this at whatever time you are, but we are between two Sundays. And with me right now is my good mate, Mark Beresford. Mark, hello.
Hello, Mark. How are you?
I'm alive and kicking, and
Good.
we are going to have a bit of a chat about some readings. Now, between two Sundays, for those who are uninitiated listeners at this point, we have a chat about the readings from the Revised Common Lectionary from which we have just lived out of from the Sunday previous. Just a little bit of a chat about what we're still carrying in our hearts from last Sunday. And then we have a chat about, or a longer chat, as we look into the readings that we're moving into for the Sunday to come. Probably a word of caution. What we share isn't always necessarily based on deep theological knowledge, although both of us have some of that skill behind us and do use some of that skill in looking and reading and analyzing the text. But a lot of it comes from just devotional reading, lectio divina, a spiritual reading of the text, and really listening to the heart of God for it. And we invite you to join us in the conversation by dropping your own comments at any of the places where you can catch the podcast. How's that for an intro? There you go. An instructional
Well done.
version. Thank
Very good.
you. Last week, we were in the fourth Sunday after Pentecost, and the readings were Genesis 21, 8 to 21, Psalm 86, verses 1 to 17, Romans 6, verses 1 to 11, and Matthew 10, verses 24 to 29. Mate, what clung on from last Sunday for
Hmm.
you?
Yeah. Yeah, I ended up sitting with that Matthew 10 passage this week. A disciple is not above the teacher, nor a slave above the master. It is enough for the disciple to be like the teacher and the slave like the master. Just sitting with that, I wonder if that's just the kind of verse you could come across in Matthew and say, I need to read the whole of Matthew as a story with this one sitting in the back of my mind. The idea that this path Jesus takes, I'm learning this path. So often we read the Gospels as though we're just reading about Jesus, and maybe learning his ways, yes, but how consciously do we read the life of Christ with the question, I'm called to live this life again in my own context. I'm called to be like this master. I think that's often quite a different way to the way a lot of people read the Gospels. What if I was to read it with the expectation that this is mapping out my path as a disciple, not just telling me about the life of Christ a couple of thousand years ago?
Mm. Which that lens would add a lot more weight to that Genesis reading that we were looking at last week.
Yeah, yes. Yes.
Which is pretty powerful.
Mm.
What's interesting is I there were two lines from the Psalm that stuck with me. So Psalm 86,
Yeah,
verse
yeah.
4, gladden the soul of your servant, for to you, Lord, I lift up my soul. And then again in verse 6, give ear, O Lord, to my prayer, listen to my cry of supplication. And verse 7 as well, in the day of my trouble, I call on you, for you will answer me. So what I'm seeing here
Mm.
is a psalm where somebody's obviously in distress or trouble, but they're already coming with a heart of gratitude and a heart of hope. They haven't, again, just touching on that, I know it comes up quite a lot, but it's a really important teaching that I got from Patrick Oliver, who's a spiritual director based in Brisbane, in one of his books, where he talks about the difference between expectation and hope. And of course, expectation is when we come to God already with the plan devised in our head about how it's going to look once we've prayed and God does what God needs to do. Hope, on the other hand, leaves all of the what it's going to look like to God and simply rests in the fact that God will answer. And that line in particular, in the day of my trouble, I call on you, for you will answer me. This person is simply looking for
Mm.
God's response. but also trusts and is grateful that God listens and will respond. And I wonder how our prayer life might become if that's how we were to approach prayer. So yeah, that was what stuck pretty hard for me from last week. Right there.
Very nice.
Right there. And of course, this week we're moving into the 5th Sunday after Pentecost because 5 comes after 4. And we are going to be reading this week Genesis 22
at least
1.
down here.
Yeah, that's right. Genesis 22 verses 1 to 14, Psalm 13, Romans 6 verses 12 to 23, and Matthew 10 verses 40 to 42. Of course, you'll find all those readings in the show notes below or underneath the video if you're watching on YouTube, or you can go straight to lectionary.library.vanderbilt.edu and you'll find the whole 3-year lectionary along with all some great, amazing resources that you can use for your service or for your reflection time right there in that at their website. Any place you want to particularly start this week, mate?
I know. I'm happy to go top to bottom.
Let's go top to bottom.
You want to do?
Yeah, top to bottom's fine. So Genesis 22 is I think, one of the most misunderstood stories that we read in the Hebrew text. And it's a story about Abraham being asked to sacrifice his son Isaac. And for me, I've come to a particular understanding of this story, which I think lends itself to a more healthy understanding than God tells Abraham to kill his son. What sort of a loving God is that? And then last minute whips it out from underneath him and goes, hey, gotcha, or whatever that looks like. And then says, but this is good that you wanted to kill your son because you've shown your faith in me. I'm a little bit lost on that. So it took me a long time, a lot of study to come to the place of understanding that I do here. And interestingly, our mate Paul Wallace has an interesting take on this one as well, based on his understanding of the reading of the words for God in this text. That's another story, but I'm very interested on looking at that more too. But in this particular understanding that I hold to right now, what you have is, remember, we talked a couple of weeks ago because we've been following Abraham's story over the last couple of weeks. Abraham was called to come away from his father's household. Now, once again, that doesn't mean that his father's house. It means his father's way of being and doing, which the ancient peoples thought was very cyclical, because it simply happens to your granddad and then happens to your dad and then it happens to you and then it happens to your children. And it's simply history repeating itself over and over and over again. So the idea was you learn how to do things the way your parents did them so that you could repeat them, because that's how the world worked. So Abraham gets called out of this and gets told by God, I'm going to take you to a new place to do a new thing and show you how to have a better relationship with God. And through that blessing that you have, share it with the rest of the world. And so we get to then, that's in Genesis 12. So 10 chapters later, Abraham finally gets this son of promise. And at the beginning of chapter 22, this God says to Abraham, take your only son Isaac, whom you love, go to Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I shall show you. And then that's verse 2. And verse 3 says, so Abraham rose the next morning, he saddled his donkey, took 2 of his young men with him, and his son Isaac, cut the wood and went to the place. Later on, he goes to pick up a knife. So there's obviously a knife here. And what's really interesting about this is that when God says, go, make a burnt offering of your son, Abraham doesn't go, how? And he doesn't go, why? Or say what now? He just goes, okay. And the reason why he can go, okay, is because this was a practice, not a common practice, not as common as a lot of people think, but it was a practice among some of the ancient religions that Sacrifice was something that you brought to the gods because you didn't know where you stood with the gods. And so you got a good crop. So you give some of that crop back to the god because A, you wanted to give thanks, and B, you wanted to keep it happy. So it would keep giving you good crops. Following year, you get drought. What do? You take some of the crops that you do have and you give it to the god. Why? Because it worked last year, and B, you've obviously made this god unhappy somehow because this god is not blessing you again. And so you never really knew where you stood. And so you kept giving offerings. And if there was drought for a few years and you ran out of crops to give, what do? Well, then you start doing animals. And ultimately it gets so desperate or whatever that end up sacrificing people in your family. And so when this God says, well, sacrifice your son, Abraham knows what to do because it's what ancient peoples had in their kit of things that they could do to please the gods. And so he goes, this God obviously needs pleasing. Okay, that's what we do. Note very carefully, and this is what I think a lot of people miss, it doesn't say Abraham was happy about this. The emotion of Abraham in this is not mentioned. And I imagine Abraham could have been deep down absolutely distraught. Maybe even not deep down, maybe even visually distraught at the thought of having to kill this child that they've waited so long for. But he does it anyway, because that's what you do to please the gods. And when you get up the hill, it's interesting too. I've seen pictures in kids' books of the Bible. That's a joke, by the way. I know they have them, but should we really have kids' books of the Bible? He's standing over Isaac with a knife raised like this. But in verse 10, it actually says he hasn't picked up the knife yet. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to kill his son. So it doesn't say he's raised it yet. He simply reached out his hand to take it. And that's when God stops him. And God stops him because he wants Abraham to know this is not the way we're going to do things anymore. Now, you might say, well, why didn't he just say that in the first place? And the reason why, I think, is human nature. We aren't very good at being told it's going to be different now. And we aren't really good being told that things are going to be easier now, especially when it comes to things that we don't feel we deserve. And so imagine if God had just gone to Abraham and said, okay, Abraham, listen, I know that you've been in your father's household. It's regular practice for you to sacrifice, to bring sacrifices, and eventually people. But no more. Okay, all good. Abraham's going to go, really? What if something goes wrong? And then the first time that you go wrong, the temptation to go and bring an offering anyway would have completely been there. And so what happens in this story is God literally says, here's the norm, but it doesn't have to be this way anymore. And notice what this God does. This God who, when we get to the prophets, is saying, I don't care about your sacrifices. I don't even technically want your sacrifices, is saying to Abraham in Genesis, right at the start, there's a ram in the thicket, sacrifice that. Now, why would he do that if he's saying sacrifices are important? Because he knows that Abraham and the whole people of history, they've got to get it out of their system. And they're going to see things going on around them where they're going to go, well, they get success, they sacrifice things, maybe we should as well. So here is a God who is making a way for human beings to literally slowly wean out of their system all these things that they think they need to do in order to encounter God, so that they can come to a place of finally having freedom to encounter God no matter what. And this is what we have by the time we get to the prophets, when the prophets are saying, I've got the cattle on 1,000 hills. What on earth do I need your sacrifice for? That's not what it's about. And then we get to Jesus, who says, look, let's just get this over and done with. Let me show you what sacrifice actually looks like. And what sacrifice actually looks like is not Jesus on the cross pretending to be a lamb. Sacrifice actually looks like love. That's the sacrifice that God wants, a sacrifice of love. which may end up getting us killed in some circumstances, which is why Jesus models it that way. But our sacrifice is sacrifice of love, to look after our neighbor, to look after ourselves, to seek after God. Love is the sacrifice. So this is the first part of a journey towards that end. And if we see it through those eyes, the whole juxtaposition of loving God tells old dude to take his only son and knock him off to make God happy. We can move past that and move into something that far more resembles the God we've come to know.
What struck me as I was reading this this time, and obviously like you, I've read it many times, and there are New Testament parallels here between what Abraham is doing and what God is doing with Jesus on the cross. So there are parallels made. What struck me was how much this story is told from the perspective of Abraham. So it's not told from the perspective of Isaac. And if you, I know there's certainly some debate around this, but if you were to hold this story as a type of what God is doing on the cross with Jesus, you actually have the story told from the perspective of God rather than the perspective of Jesus, if you understand what I'm saying here. So Abraham, so this is telling us a story of the cost to God, not of the cost to Jesus, of the cost to Abraham, not of the cost to Isaac. Although there's plenty of arguments around that would suggest that Isaac by now is not a child, but is probably in his prime, and the capacity to overcome Abraham is probably there. So he's either a young man or maybe even into his 20s by now. So you have this, you do have this very submissive kind of action on Isaac's part.
Yes.
But what struck me was that the story is told from Abraham's perspective, the one who is giving up the life of his son, rather than the one who is giving up his life. And I thought there's something important in that, especially when I get to the story of Jesus on the cross. Sometimes we do have this, we do sit with this, God is just taking vengeance. God is just angry here. And we have this sort of wrathful perspective. But I wondered if seeing this story, especially from the perspective of Abraham, could help us see that the two greatest costs, I think, are being made at the point of Jesus on the cross, and it's being made here as well. That probably one of the greatest things we could ever give up is our children. As parents, give up our children. I think that's that is one of the things we protect to the very end. But of course, one of the other things we protect to the very end is our lives. And I wonder if there's a way here, especially by reading through this story and seeing it from the perspective of Abraham, that reminds us that even if you do take when you look at the cross, this is not God delighting in this, but God counting the cost. So you've got a cost on both sides rather than a cost on one. I do think there's lots and lots of ways to read that, but there are moments in the New Testament where this story is paralleled with what goes on the cross. And I wonder if the paralleling of this story actually gives us reason to say this is not a God delighting in the murder of his son, but this is a God who is giving up his very best, who is showing love, as you were saying before.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's so much in it, and so many rabbinical interpretations of it.
Yeah.
That are
There's
worth considering.
interestingly, there's a number of versions of this
Mm.
story told in the ancient world, told in the ancient Jewish world, and Isaac doesn't survive all of them. So there is some kind of progression of this story being told that either ends here or perhaps even develops out from here as well. This is a story that has a number of versions, and I think that's very, very intriguing. That means to me that people are playing with this story, people are imagining through this story, people are telling it in different ways. And here we have, in our scriptures, we have a story where the sacrifice is stopped completely, which I think is, as you say, is radically countercultural, and to move. And I like what you were saying there about well, what I heard was God speaking the language that can be absorbed now, in that progression from child sacrifice, which was prevalent, through to the sacrifice of an animal. And eventually we're moving through in the Christian story to the sacrifice of Jesus, which ends all sacrifices. And you do end up with Christianity that doesn't sacrifice at all.
Mm.
And if there is a sacrifice, it is a sacrifice of love. It is the giving of love, because that is ultimately what this story and the story of, and its echoes through the gospel tells us, that love is the most prevalent. And love is what God first gives and what God desires as well. So we're straight back to relationship.
Yeah, and I really like what you're saying there too about the perspective of Abraham is the one that's focused on, and seeing this through Abraham's eyes, and then using that as a shadow to view and understand how God felt in terms of giving sacrifice, which really helps us understand Psalm 13 in a deep and wonderful way, because if you imagine Abraham being told, sacrifice your son, go up the hill, do what you have to do, you know what that goes on. This could almost be his prayer. Oh Lord, how will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? Must I bear pain in my soul and have sorrow in my heart all day long? And how long shall my enemy be exalted over me? Consider and answer me, Lord. Give light to my eyes, or I will sleep the sleep of death. And my enemy will say, I have prevailed. My soul's rejoiced because I am shaken. But I trusted in your steadfast love. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation. I will sing to the Lord because he has dealt bountifully with me. Once again, someone crying out to God, but holding that hope deep down. Even though this is the crappiest thing I've ever had to do, take this promised son. Gee, I hope Sarah doesn't ask where we're going. Why have you got a knife, Abraham? What's that for? I'm just going to trust. But it's always happening, but right in the midst of all the crap, I trusted in your steadfast love. And I think that, that little bit at the beginning of verse 5, even on itself, is worth $1,000,000. I trusted in your steadfast love. And friends who are listening, whatever you're going through right now, I know it sounds ridiculous. I know it probably even sounds trite, but to simply trust in God's love. God isn't causing your pain. God's with you in your pain. And if we can understand those two things, as we saw with Abraham, God will bring some sort of resolution about it. May not be what we expect, but we can hope in God because we can trust.
Yeah. I really like holding this psalm alongside the story of Abraham. In many ways, we see faith here because it's a story that we've made quite central as far as the Hebrew scriptures go in our understanding of the New Testament. But I like that this psalm really just reminds us that faith is not an easy thing. It is going through this experience of, God, are you forgetting? Where are you? Faith is not the absence of questions. Actually, faith is probably the presence of questions. And I like that this psalm is resolved, but I always find myself reminded of those psalms that aren't. This one kind of moves nicely from the pain and uncertainty and the questions into this space of rejoicing and salvation. Not all psalms do this, and I think it's always a good reminder for us too that sometimes that uncertain space that's covered in the first few verses of Psalm 13 is well, the perspective of being there is always unresolved, I think.
Yeah.
So those unresolved psalms become really, really vital, because we probably have a tendency to read a psalm like this to kind of rush through the spaces of uncertainty and get to that resolution. And it should encourage us that that's coming, I suppose. But actually, a lot of people live in that liminal space where they're not sure what's really going on.
Yeah.
And I think that often is the space of faith. And surely, as we read that Abraham story, he must be sitting in uncertain space for most of this account. And it's a pretty heart-wrenching space for him to be in. It's not like he can see the end. He can see a resolution himself. He's really blinded to that. I don't think he can imagine that we're going to move from children to sheep in this in this story. I think he's kind of resolved in this direction that God has asked this of him. And even though I agree with you, I don't think there's a lot of emotion in the story, the way it's told. It is a heart-wrenching story. It's an awful story in so many ways.
Yeah, absolutely. Romans 6.
Yes.
Very, very well known. But the phrase that stuck out for me as I read through Romans 6 was have become, in verse 18, have become slaves of righteousness. Now, a little bit above that, in verse 16, Paul talks about how, if you present yourself to anyone as obedient slaves, you are slaves of the one you obey. And I don't know why, but for some reason, I'd never thought of this whole conversation in Romans 6 as being so easy to understand as when we understand that obedience demonstrates our loyalty. And what Paul is saying here is, and here's the thing, I think we read Romans 6 traditionally and we go, oh yeah, slaves to sin, look at you, oh, carrying this burden of sin, become a slave of righteousness, everything will be okay. I think what he's actually saying, remember that he's writing to a church of people who have had their revelation of this truth, that if we're living the life of abundance as Jesus showed us how to live, we'll actually learn to live without that weight of sin. That's the way it goes. And so you have Paul then saying, not so much, oh, the weight of sin, oh, so bad. He's actually saying, I think, hey, you're slave to the thing you obey. So you could keep on obeying that brokenness and living in that brokenness. But what if you obeyed that sense and call and temptation, if you want to put it that way, that temptation for justice, which is what that word righteousness means, right? When we're talking about righteousness, most times in the New Testament, we're talking about righteousness, we're talking about justice. And so really, when you start to see this, you start to go, yeah, so you think about sin, you think about walking along the street, seeing something and going, oh, I could do this. It'd be bad, it'd be naughty, but I'd do it. Paul is saying, look, you could do that and you could keep on doing that, or you could flip the coin and go, oh, there's something good to do. Or what if I did it? And when you think about it like that, you go, there's something really healthy about that. There's something really healthy about what Paul is saying here in this passage about flip the coin, change the perspective. And when we do, and this is the really interesting thing, when we do, it no longer is an argument about I'm living this sinful life, but I'm doing my best to live well. It's actually, I'm actually living my best life. Every now and then I screw it up, but I'm about living my best life. And I wondered as I contemplated this passage and thought about what it was talking about, why don't we generally live that way? Now, I've got my own opinions about why it is that churches have traditionally taught something slightly different to that idea. But I think it's wonderful to think that we could literally look at the life of Jesus and go, oh, that's how it's meant to be lived. And remembering that this eternal life that Paul talks about in verse 22 and 23, that word eternal, aeon, isn't about length of time, someplace you go after you die. It's about the abundance of life and the fullness of life that you live now. And so again, what if we can live in a way that says, I'm going to walk around and keep looking for the things that are going to bring justice to the world, that are going to be right in the world, that's going to bring goodness to the world, it's going to bring truth and wholeness and beauty. What if I had my radar stuck on for those things, knowing that there'll be occasional thing that will come the other way, rather than living out of the perspective of, oh, I'm so bad and I'm so broken and I'm so crushed. I'm going to try my very best to do the good stuff. That I don't think that's what Paul's getting at. I really think he's saying, hey, look at the way Jesus lived. You're living under that now. Live free, live well, live full, live abundance, live goodness, truth, and beauty. And look for those things, focus on those things, not the other way around. And when you start to think about it from that perspective and talk about it from that perspective, it actually is incredibly uplifting, and totally moves us away from that weight of original sin idea and gets us back to live into the original goodness in how we were created to be.
Yeah. I wonder if we see this, I'm not quite sure what verse it is, but it's a fair way down here. For just as you once presented members as slaves to impurity and to greater and greater iniquity, so now present your members as slaves to righteousness for sanctification. So we've got this, what I would call a regress, as these people are slaves to impurity and they go to greater and greater iniquity. But then you have progress. So now present your members as slaves to righteousness for sanctification. And I'm thinking of sanctification as being as much a progress, a process, as this greater and greater iniquity is taking them down. So there is this sense of grow into this, which I think is beautiful. I really like what you were saying there about being slaves to righteousness, learning to be tempted in that direction. I think that's really, really healthy. And I found myself thinking, I wonder if I think of worship in this kind of way. So here we have, look, choose what you're a slave to. You are a slave. Choose what you're a slave to. I think worship can be thought of as the same. Choose what you will worship. Worship God, worship the world, worship whatever you choose. But know that you will worship. Know that you will be a slave. I think you can say the same with faith. Know that you will have faith, but put your faith in God. But you will have faith. There's no, these terms are not actually debated. And here, the consistent term used throughout this is slavery. It's who will you be a slave to the one who will make you free, or will you be a slave to the one who will keep you in slavery, who will control everything and who will make your world destructive. But what is not debated here is whether we are slaves to whether or not we are slaves. That is not debated here. It's the debate is to whom will you serve? The debate is who will you worship, not whether you will worship. The debate is in whom you will have faith, not whether you have faith. And I think this is really helpful. For me, it just reminds us of our very nature, that it is vital that we put our faith in one who has our best at heart, who loves us. It is vital that we worship one who has our best at heart. We can't give that essence of who we are to one who is not trustworthy. And here, who will you serve? Will you serve one who has your best at heart, who started the story by saying, I serve you in the most radical and costly way? And it's just a matter of where we put our trust.
Yeah.
But you can understand why Jesus goes throughout the Gospels over and over again. It's your faith. Calls us back to faith, calls us to where we will trust. Not whether we will trust, but to where we will trust, who we will trust.
Yeah. Which is interesting, all this talk about slavery. And the very last verse starts talking about wages. There are no wages in slavery.
Yeah. Yes.
I don't know whether Paul's getting his metaphors mixed up or something, or I do wonder if there's something in that. He slipped into this talk about wages, knowing full well that wages are not something that slavery is connected to. There's no wages for the slave.
It would be interesting to look into that word wages there. I wonder if it's I've certainly heard this preached more often as outcomes rather than wages.
Well, just very quickly doing a smack into the Greek, and it says that, it says nothing. Why does it say nothing? There we go. Opsonion is the word that's used, which talks about payment or reward. And so you could say it's a reward.
Reward would be interesting to pursue.
An outcome or fitting compensation is another. But figuratively, yeah.
Just in the sentence just before that, in the version I've got in front of me, the advantage you get is sanctification.
That's the NRSV, yeah.
Yeah. So advantage is that's not that we wouldn't link that term to wage, closely to wage necessarily.
No, that's true. In fact, the word that's used is karpon, which is fruit.
Right. The fruit.
So the fruit is sanctification.
Yes.
So that changes things. Yeah.
I like that. Yeah. How'd you go with the gospel?
I went. The gospel, this is a good one. And it follows on obviously from last week. But again, I think there's something, you were talking about in the Genesis one about, see it from, not from the perspective of Isaac, but it's actually from the perspective of Abraham.
Yes. Yep.
This is one of those passages that Jesus is talking about how someone else will relate to his disciples. And yet what he talks about here, I don't think is as much for the person who's going to relate to his disciples as it is for the disciple. So just like last week, we had that whole, these people are going to show you hospitality. You're going in with this great message and whatever else, but you have to accept hospitality. It's not all about you. I think this continues that theme if you read it really carefully. We often read it and go, oh, look, if these people give a glass of water to one of your disciple, they will not lose their reward. But I don't think this is said for the benefit of the one who's giving the water. I think it's said for the benefit of the one who's receiving it. And I think that because A, it carries on from last week, but B, there's a very important message here about the person that's doing the thing to the disciple. You remember there was another story where the disciples came to Jesus and said, there's some dude over the river who's casting out demons and healing the sick. Should we go stop him? And Jesus goes, no. If they're for me, that can't be against me. And initially you think, hang on a second, what do you mean for you? They're not talking about you. They're not preaching you. They're not getting people they're just casting out demons and healing the sick. And I think Jesus would say to that question, yep, because that is my message. Bring love, bring wholeness to the world. So they're for me. Whether they're preaching about me and using my name or not, they're for me because they're about love, they're about healing, they're about wholeness. And so there's this accept them. And I think this here is getting at the same type of angle. The person who welcomes you welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. In other words, and I'll use contemporary terminology, if that LGBTQI couple invite you into their home for a meal, they've welcomed me. And if they've welcomed me, they've welcomed the one who sent me. Now, I'm not going to get into an argument on this, but that this is saying that we must or mustn't think a particular way about LGBTQI issues. Right? I think most people who've listened to our show know where I stand on that completely. Sure. However, even if you were to say that you felt that LGBTQI issues were something that God did not agree with, if you felt that way, you should not deny an invitation to go and have a meal with them. You should not deny an invitation to sit with them. You should not deny an invitation to be with them, to speak in an LGBTQI congregation if you were invited. Why? Because the one who welcomes you welcomes me. And then Jesus goes on, whoever welcomes a prophet in the name of a prophet receives a prophet's reward, and whoever welcomes a righteous person in the name of a righteous person receives the reward of the righteous. And whoever gives a cup of cold water to one of these little ones is my disciple. I tell you, none of these will lose their reward. Jesus is not talking about the one being rewarded. He's talking to the one who is being received or given the cup.
Yes.
They're the ones who need to view this other person as someone whom God still has in their hand, someone who is still going to receive a reward from God, and based on verse 40, that first verse of this passage, can literally represent God and has God in their midst even before we get there.
Yeah. I love that reflection. I think it's very important that we hold, we look for the perspective of the way a passage is being told, and I entirely agree. This is asking the disciples as they go out into the world to look positively on the repetition here, which is welcome, over and over again. This is welcome. It is asking us to be people who recognize those who are hospitable toward us and who take the risk, I suppose, of saying, I see God's hand at work here in your welcome to me.
I saw a Facebook post a little while ago of a well-known Australian Christian political voice, let's put it that way. And they took a selfie of themselves sitting in a cafe, I think it was in Melbourne or Sydney, with a rainbow flag behind them. This person was one of the many voices, unfortunately, who were very strong in the media about saying no to gay marriage. And that's probably, unfortunately for them, what they're most well known for in Australia now. And the caption on the photo was something along the lines of reading my Bible while I have a coffee. I think that was something like those lines. And it was interesting, the comments that were coming up afterwards from people who were supporters of this person and this person's work were things like, haha, that's showing them, good on you. But I wonder whether the best caption that, or best comment someone could have given to that photo and caption was, well, whoever welcomes you welcomes me.
Yeah.
And I think many Christians, and again, whether you agree with me about my position on this issue or not is irrelevant. Are you welcoming? Because they're welcoming you. And if you are going to react to that, then basically what you're bringing is an enmity between
that's right.
where God is.
The refusal of welcome. So you become the rejecter at that point.
Yes. It's a very
which is deeply disturbing, isn't it? To be doing that in the name of Jesus.
Yes. That's what makes it even worse. There we go. Some great readings for this week, and we would love to hear what you think about them. Please pop onto the comments on YouTube below if you're on YouTube. Respond to the Spotify question. What did you think of this episode? Leave your comment there. We love to share them on the show on the few times we have, and we'd love to hear your perspectives and to be a part of this conversation with us. This is not us pontificating anything. It's us. Mark and I literally read these readings. We come together. We don't script the show. What you hear is our conversation together, and we would love for your voice to be a part of that conversation too. So please drop comments. Drop on Mark's website, barefootfollower.life. Drop comments there. You can drop them on my DMs at Instagram at monkindocs, or go to monkindocs.podia.com. Or if you go into the show notes, you'll see our link tree, and you'll find links to lots of other things that we do as well. So that's this week's readings, which were Genesis 22, 1 to 14, Psalm 13, Romans 6, verses 12 to 23, and Matthew 10, verses 40 to 42. Mate, I think that's a show.
Very good. That was a good one.
Very good indeed. So till next week, folks, peace, greetings, and love, and have a good week. Cheers. Bye for now.
Yeah.